Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of California's gold country. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented stories reach. In the winter of 1849, when the promise of gold had drawn thousands of desperate souls to the muddy camps surrounding Sutter's Mill, a peculiar incident was recorded in the ledger of the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office. The entry, written in faded ink on yellowed paper, described the disappearance of approximately 200 ounces of gold dust from the McAllister Ranch, located 7 miles southwest of Coloma. What made this particular theft noteworthy was not the amount stolen, but rather the circumstances surrounding its discovery and the individuals involved in what would become one of the most quietly disturbing episodes in the annals of California's gold rush. The McAllister family had arrived in California territory in the spring of 1848, just months before James Marshall's discovery at Sutter's Mill would transform the quiet Sacramento Valley into a chaotic epicenter of human greed and desperation. Jeremiah McAllister, a stern man of Scottish descent with weathered hands and calculating eyes, had purchased 800 acres of rolling grassland from a Mexican landowner eager to escape the approaching American tide. Unlike the thousands who would soon arrive with nothing but pans and wild dreams, McAllister came with substantial savings accumulated from 15 years of successful cattle ranching in Missouri. His wife, Margaret, had died during the overland journey, leaving him to raise their only child, Hannah, who had just turned 18 when they established their homestead in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada foothills. Hannah McAllister was described by contemporary accounts as a young woman of striking appearance, with auburn hair that caught the morning light and green eyes that neighbors remembered as both intelligent and strangely unsettling. The Reverend Thomas Whitman, who conducted irregular services at the small Methodist church in nearby Diamond Springs, noted in his personal journal that Hannah possessed an unusual intensity when she spoke, as if she were always listening to something others couldn't hear. She had been educated beyond what was typical for frontier women of the time, having spent 3 years at a female seminary in St. Louis before the family's westward migration. This education, combined with the isolation of ranch life and the trauma of losing her mother on the trail, had created in Hannah a peculiar combination of sophistication and wilderness pragmatism that would prove significant in the events to come. The McAllister Ranch occupied a strategic position along what would later become known as the Weber Creek Route, a well-traveled path between the mining camps of Placerville and the supply depot at Mormon Island. Jeremiah had chosen the location carefully, knowing that proximity to the mining district would provide numerous opportunities for a man with business acumen and ready capital. By the autumn of 1849, he had established a profitable operation, providing beef, grain, and supplies to the constantly shifting population of prospectors who worked the creeks and gulches of the Mother Lode. His success was evident in the substantial log house he had built, complete with glass windows shipped at great expense from San Francisco, and in the heavy wooden safe he had installed in a specially constructed room behind the kitchen. It was on a particularly cold morning in November of 1849 that Hannah McAllister encountered the man who would become the catalyst for the disturbing events that followed. She'd been riding along Weber Creek, checking the fence lines that marked the eastern boundary of their property, when she discovered a figure collapsed beside the frozen stream. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with dark hair and the hollow-eyed appearance common among prospectors who had spent months working claims that yielded little more than subsistence. His clothes were torn and inadequate for the mountain cold, and a crude wooden crutch lay beside him in the frost-covered grass. When Hannah dismounted and approached, she found the stranger conscious but weak from hunger and exposure. his left leg clearly injured and poorly set after what appeared to have been a serious break. According to Hannah's later testimony to the sheriff, the man identified himself as Owen Burke, originally from County Cork in Ireland. He claimed to have arrived in California 6 months earlier aboard a ship that had rounded Cape Horn, and to have spent the intervening time working various claims along the American River and its tributaries. His current condition, he explained, was the result of a cave-in at a placer mine near Auburn, which had trapped him for several hours and crushed his leg before other miners could dig him free. Since the accident, he had been unable to work effectively, and his small savings had been depleted by the exorbitant prices charged for food and shelter in the mining camps. He had been making his way south, hoping to find work that didn't require the physical demands of mining, when exhaustion and cold had finally overcome him. Hannah later told the sheriff that something about the stranger's story had moved her to an immediate and powerful sympathy. Perhaps it was the man's educated manner of speaking, so different from the rough frontier dialect she had grown accustomed to, or perhaps it was simply the Christian duty her mother had instilled in her before death claimed the older woman on the trail west. Whatever the reason, Hannah made a decision that would later seem inexplicable to those who knew her father's strict views on charity and his deep suspicion of the transient population that the gold rush had brought to their previously peaceful valley. She helped Owen Burke onto her horse and brought him back to the ranch, where she installed him in the small bunkhouse her father had built for seasonal workers. Jeremiah McAllister's reaction to his daughter's act of mercy was, according to the account later provided to investigators, both predictable and strangely muted. Neighbors who knew the rancher described him as a man who measured every action in terms of profit and loss, and who had little patience for what he considered misplaced sentimentality. Yet when Hannah presented Owen Burke as a temporary guest who would work for his keep once his leg healed, her father offered no immediate objection. Some who witnessed this interaction later commented that Jeremiah seemed almost relieved to have another man on the property, even one in Burke's weakened condition. The rancher had been expressing concern about reports of claim jumpers and road agents operating in the area, and Burke's presence, however diminished by injury, represented at least the appearance of additional protection for the isolated homestead. The arrangement that developed over the following weeks struck those who observed it as both natural and somehow wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. Owen Burke proved to be intelligent and educated, with a knowledge of literature and current affairs that provided Hannah with conversation she had sorely missed since leaving Missouri. His injury prevented him from performing the heavy labor typical of ranch work, but he proved useful in maintaining equipment, keeping accounts, and handling the correspondence necessary for Jeremiah's various business dealings with merchants in Sacramento and San Francisco. Most significantly, Burke possessed a detailed knowledge of mining techniques and ore assessment that Jeremiah found valuable in evaluating potential investments in local mining operations. Throughout December of 1849, as the Sierra Nevada winter began in earnest, the three residents of the McAllister Ranch settled into a routine that appeared, from the outside, to function smoothly. Hannah continued her management of the household and her oversight of the small herd of cattle that had survived the journey from Missouri. Jeremiah traveled frequently to the mining camps and to Sacramento, often staying away for several days while he conducted business. Owen Burke's leg gradually healed, though he continued to walk with a pronounced limp that would remain with him for the rest of his brief life. During the long evenings, when the winter winds howled down from the mountains and the isolation of their situation became most apparent, Hannah and Burke often sat by the fire in the main house, reading from the small library of books she had brought west, while Jeremiah worked on his accounts or studied maps of local mining districts. It was during this period that several visitors to the ranch noted what they later described as an unusual atmosphere within the household. The Reverend Whitman, who had accepted Jeremiah's invitation to conduct a Christmas service at the ranch, recorded in his journal that the relationship between Hannah and Burke seemed to involve an intensity of communication that went beyond mere conversation. He noted that they often seemed to understand each other without speaking, and that Hannah's manner toward the injured prospector displayed a level of concern that struck the minister as inappropriate for an unmarried woman toward a man who was, after all, a stranger and a dependent upon her father's charity. More disturbing to Whitman was his observation that Jeremiah McAllister seemed not only aware of his daughter's attachment to their guest, but actively encouraging it. During the Christmas service, the minister noted, Jeremiah made several pointed references to the value of having a man of Burke's education and mining knowledge permanently associated with the family's interests. These comments were made in Burke's presence and seemed designed to suggest that a more formal arrangement might be beneficial to all parties involved. Hannah's reaction to her father's hints was described by Whitman as a curious mixture of pleasure and what the minister characterized as a kind of guilty apprehension, as if she were both eager for such an arrangement and aware that something about it was fundamentally wrong. The winter months passed, with little apparent change in the household dynamics, but beneath the surface of domestic routine, developments were occurring that would not become apparent until much later. Burke's knowledge of mining had proven so valuable to Jeremiah's business ventures that the rancher had begun including his guest in increasingly significant financial decisions. By February of 1850, Burke was regularly accompanying Jeremiah on trips to evaluate potential investments, and his assessments of ore samples and mining equipment had helped McAllister avoid several costly mistakes while identifying opportunities that proved highly profitable. The exact nature of these business arrangements was never fully documented, but evidence discovered later suggested that Burke had been promised a substantial share of the profits in exchange for his expertise and continued association with the family. During this same period, Hannah's relationship with Burke had evolved in ways that would later prove significant to understanding the events that followed. While maintaining the appearance of propriety required by frontier social conventions, the two had developed an intimacy that was evident to anyone who observed them closely. Hannah had taken to nursing Burke through periodic episodes of pain caused by his poorly healed injury, and these sessions of care had created opportunities for private conversation and physical closeness that might otherwise have been impossible under her father's watchful supervision. More significantly, Burke had begun sharing with Hannah detailed information about his mining experiences and his knowledge of gold extraction techniques, information that would later prove relevant to the investigation into the disappearance of Jeremiah's accumulated wealth. The first indication that something was seriously wrong at the McAllister Ranch came in early March of 1850, when Jeremiah failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with Samuel Morrison, a Sacramento merchant who had been purchasing cattle from the rancher on a monthly basis for nearly a year. Morrison later testified that this absence was completely uncharacteristic of McAllister, who had never before failed to honor a business appointment, and who had been scrupulously punctual in all their previous dealings. When Morrison sent a messenger to the ranch to inquire about the missed meeting, the man returned with the disturbing report that the property appeared to be abandoned. The main house was locked and shuttered, the livestock were unattended, and there was no sign of any of the three residents. Morrison's subsequent decision to contact the sheriff's office initiated an investigation that would reveal a sequence of events so disturbing that many of the details were deliberately omitted from the official reports filed with the territorial authorities. Deputy Sheriff William Crawford, accompanied by Morrison and two other local men, arrived at the McAllister Ranch on March 8th, 1850. Their initial survey of the property confirmed that it had been abandoned recently, probably within the previous 2 weeks, based on the condition of the livestock and the household goods left behind. The front door of the main house had been left unlocked, which struck the investigators as suspicious given Jeremiah's known concerns about theft and his habit of securing his property carefully whenever he traveled. The interior of the house provided the first concrete evidence that something violent had occurred. The main room showed signs of significant disturbance, with furniture overturned and personal belongings scattered across the floor. More ominously, there were dark stains on the wooden floor near the fireplace that appeared to be blood, though the amount was not sufficient to indicate a fatal injury. The investigators noted that valuable items, including Hannah's jewelry and the family's small collection of silver plate, had been left undisturbed, suggesting that robbery had not been the motive for whatever had taken place. The most significant discovery came when the investigators examined the specially constructed room where Jeremiah had kept his safe. The heavy iron strongbox, which Morrison estimated could have contained several $1,000s in gold dust and coin, based on McAllister's recent business success, was empty. The safe had not been forced open. Instead, it appeared to have been unlocked with the proper combination, suggesting that whoever had emptied it possessed intimate knowledge of Jeremiah's security arrangements. More puzzling was the fact that the safe had been left open, with documents and papers scattered on the floor around it, as if the person responsible had been searching for something specific among McAllister's records. Among these scattered papers, Deputy Crawford found several items that would prove central to understanding what had transpired at the ranch. The most significant was a letter written in Hannah's distinctive handwriting, addressed to an attorney in San Francisco. The letter, dated February 28, 1850, requested legal advice regarding the inheritance rights of a woman whose father had died without leaving a will. The letter specifically inquired about the circumstances under which property might pass to a daughter rather than to male relatives, and whether marriage might affect such inheritance rights. Even more troubling was a passage in which Hannah asked about the legal consequences of failing to report a death to the proper authorities, and whether such an omission might void inheritance claims. The investigation also uncovered evidence of recent digging behind the main house, near a grove of oak trees, where Jeremiah had planned to plant an orchard. The disturbed earth covered an area approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, suggesting that something substantial had been buried there. When the investigators excavated the site, they discovered what appeared to be a hastily constructed grave containing the remains of a man in his 50s, consistent with Jeremiah McAllister's age and physical description. The body was too decomposed to permit positive identification, but the clothing and a distinctive pocket watch found with the remains confirmed that this was indeed the missing rancher. The condition of the remains suggested that death had occurred approximately 3 weeks before the discovery, placing it in mid-February. More disturbing was evidence that suggested the death had not been natural. The skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, with a depression above the left temple that could only have resulted from a severe blow with a heavy object. While it was impossible to determine whether this injury had been sufficient to cause death, its location and severity strongly suggested that violence had been involved in Jeremiah McAllister's demise. With the discovery of the body, the investigation took on a new urgency, and Deputy Crawford immediately dispatched messages to law enforcement agencies throughout Central California requesting assistance in locating Hannah McAllister and Owen Burke. The response was swift but frustrating. Despite the relatively small population of the territory and the distinctive appearance of both fugitives, no reliable sightings were reported. It was as if the two had simply vanished into the chaotic landscape of Gold Rush, California, where new arrivals and departures were so common that strangers attracted little attention, The investigation did, however, uncover evidence of careful planning that suggested the disappearance had been premeditated rather than the result of a spontaneous act of violence. Records at the Wells Fargo office in Placerville showed that someone matching Burke's description had arranged for the transfer of a substantial sum of money to an account in San Francisco on March 1st, just days after the estimated date of Jeremiah's death. The transaction had been conducted using documentation that appeared to bear Jeremiah's signature, though bank officials later acknowledged that they had not been familiar enough with the rancher's handwriting to detect a forgery. More significantly, inquiries at the various mining supply companies in Sacramento revealed that Burke had been making discreet inquiries about purchasing equipment for a new type of mining operation, one that would require significant capital investment but promised extraordinary returns. These conversations had taken place in late February, suggesting that Burke had been planning a major change in his circumstances well before Jeremiah's death. The timing of these inquiries, combined with the discovery of the empty safe, suggested a premeditated plan to acquire the funds necessary for this new venture through violence and theft. The investigation also revealed disturbing details about the relationship between Hannah and Burke that had developed during the winter months. Questioning of neighbors and occasional visitors to the ranch disclosed that the two had been observed engaging in intimate conversation and physical contact that went far beyond what was appropriate for an unmarried woman and a man who was essentially a stranger dependent upon her family's charity. More troubling were reports that Hannah had been heard making statements suggesting that her father's control over her life and prospects had become unbearable, and that she longed for the independence that would come only through his death or her marriage to someone who could protect her from his domination. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of Martha Henderson, an older woman who lived on a neighboring ranch and who had been one of Hannah's few female companions during the isolated winter months. Henderson reported that Hannah had spoken frequently about Owen Burke's mining expertise and his knowledge of locations where substantial gold deposits remained undiscovered. According to Henderson, Hannah had seemed convinced that Burke possessed information that could make them wealthy beyond anything her father's cautious business practices could achieve. Hannah had also expressed frustration with what she saw as her father's unwillingness to take the kinds of risks that could transform their comfortable circumstances into genuine prosperity. These revelations painted a picture of a young woman who had become convinced that her future lay not in the safe, but limited success her father had achieved, but in the dangerous but potentially lucrative ventures that Burke had described to her during their long winter conversations. The combination of romantic attachment and financial ambition appeared to have created a situation in which Hannah had been willing to participate in actions that would have been unthinkable under other circumstances. The evidence suggested that she had not merely been a passive victim of Burke's manipulation, but an active partner in planning and executing the events that led to her father's death and their subsequent disappearance. As the investigation continued, additional evidence emerged that suggested the crime had been planned with considerable sophistication. Analysis of the household accounts revealed that someone with detailed knowledge of Jeremiah's business practices had been systematically gathering information about his assets and their locations. Bank records showed that withdrawals from various accounts had been made over several weeks prior to the disappearance, always in amounts small enough to avoid attracting attention, but totaling a substantial sum. These transactions had been conducted using forged documents that demonstrated familiarity not only with Jeremiah's signature, but with the specific procedures required by different financial institutions. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Burke's background was more complex than he had represented to the McAllister family. Inquiries directed to authorities in San Francisco revealed that a man matching Burke's description had been involved in a confidence scheme targeting recent arrivals to California who possessed substantial savings but lacked knowledge of local conditions. The scheme had involved claims of inside information about exceptionally rich mining claims that could be purchased at below-market prices through contacts within the mining community. Several victims had reported losing significant sums of money after investing in claims that proved to be either worthless or non-existent. This information suggested that Burke's arrival at the McAllister Ranch had not been the result of accident and misfortune, as he had claimed, but rather a calculated decision to target a family that possessed both substantial assets and relative isolation from the protection that community oversight might provide. The story of the mining accident and the injured leg, while possibly true, had served as an effective means of gaining entry into the household and establishing the dependence that would make his continued presence seem natural and even beneficial to his intended victims. The search for Hannah and Burke continued throughout the spring and summer of 1850, but despite rewards offered by both the territorial government and concerned citizens, no reliable trace of either fugitive was discovered. Reports of sightings came from as far away as Oregon Territory and the Mormon settlements around Salt Lake, but none could be confirmed upon investigation. The gold rush had created a population so mobile and anonymous that two people with ready money and reasonable caution could disappear completely, especially if they were willing to abandon their identities and assume new roles in communities where no one knew their history. In September of 1850, nearly 6 months after the discovery of Jeremiah McAllister's body, the case received renewed attention when a prospector working a claim along the Mokelumne River discovered what appeared to be human remains in a shallow grave beside the stream. The location was approximately 40 miles southeast of the McAllister Ranch, in an area that would have been accessible to someone traveling on horseback, but remote enough to avoid casual discovery. The remains were too decomposed to permit positive identification, but the size and apparent age of the skeleton suggested a young adult, and fragments of cloth found with the bones were consistent with the type of dress Hannah McAllister had been known to wear. More significantly, the grave also contained a leather pouch containing approximately $50 in gold coin and a small notebook written in what appeared to be Hannah's handwriting. The notebook entries, though badly damaged by moisture and time, provided fragmentary evidence of the fugitives' movements during the months following their disappearance from the ranch. The entries described a journey southward through the mining districts, with stops at various camps and settlements where they had attempted to blend in with the transient population that characterized the gold rush communities. The final legible entry in the notebook was dated May 15th, 1850, and described what appeared to be a confrontation between Hannah and Burke over the division of the stolen gold. The entry suggested that Burke had become increasingly suspicious of Hannah's loyalty and had begun to fear that she might betray him to authorities in exchange for clemency. More ominously, the entry indicated that Burke had begun to view Hannah not as a partner in their crimes, but as a liability who possessed dangerous knowledge about his background and methods. The discovery of the notebook and the probable grave provided a partial resolution to the mystery of Hannah McAllister's fate, but it also raised new questions about Owen Burke's subsequent activities and whereabouts. If Hannah had indeed been murdered by her partner in crime, as the evidence suggested, Burke remained at large, with a substantial amount of stolen gold and demonstrated willingness to kill to protect himself. The notebook entries also revealed that Burke possessed detailed information about other wealthy ranchers and merchants in the region, suggesting that the McAllister case might have been only the beginning of a planned series of similar crimes. Despite intensive efforts by law enforcement agencies throughout California and the neighboring territories, Owen Burke was never captured or conclusively identified. Over the following years, several crimes bearing similarities to the McAllister case were reported in various parts of the West, but none could be definitively linked to Burke. The man had apparently succeeded in disappearing into the anonymous mass of fortune seekers and drifters that continued to pour into California throughout the 1850s, possibly assuming a new identity and continuing his predatory activities under a different name. The McAllister Ranch was eventually sold by the territorial authorities to satisfy outstanding debts and legal obligations, and the new owners found evidence that the property had been thoroughly searched by persons unknown, presumably in an attempt to locate any hidden assets that might have been overlooked during the original investigation. The safe room behind the kitchen showed signs of having been systematically dismantled, with sections of the walls removed and the floor excavated in several places. These searches had apparently been unsuccessful, as no additional valuables were discovered, but their thoroughness suggested that someone with intimate knowledge of Jeremiah's habits had believed that significant wealth remained hidden somewhere on the property. In 1852, nearly 2 years after the discovery of Jeremiah's body, a final piece of evidence emerged that provided a disturbing postscript to the case. A letter arrived at the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, postmarked from Portland in Oregon Territory, but bearing no return address. The letter, written in a neat hand that gave no clue to the writer's identity, claimed to provide information about the McAllister case from someone who had known Owen Burke before his arrival in California. According to the letter, Burke had been born Seamus O'Sullivan in County Cork, Ireland, and had immigrated to the United States in 1845 during the height of the Irish famine. He had initially settled in Boston, where he had worked as a clerk in a shipping office until he was discovered to have been embezzling funds from customer accounts. Rather than face prosecution, he had fled west, eventually reaching New Orleans, where he had assumed the name Owen Burke and developed the confidence schemes that would later prove so successful in California. The letter writer claimed that Burke's specialty had been identifying recent immigrants or other vulnerable individuals who possessed savings but lacked the social connections that might protect them from predatory criminals. His method involved presenting himself as an educated gentleman, fallen on temporary hard times, using his genuine intelligence and cultured manner of speaking to gain the trust of his intended victims. Once established in their households, he would gather information about their assets and security arrangements while cultivating emotional dependence, particularly among women who might be isolated or unhappy in their current circumstances. Most disturbing was the letter writer's claim that the McAllister case had not been Burke's first involvement in violent crime. According to the anonymous correspondent, Burke had been suspected in the disappearance of at least 2 other families during his journey across the continent, though investigations had been hampered by the chaos and limited communication that characterized frontier law enforcement. The letter suggested that Burke had refined his methods through practice, becoming increasingly sophisticated in his ability to identify suitable targets and eliminate potential witnesses. The letter concluded with the warning that Burke was likely still active somewhere in the Western Territories, possibly under yet another assumed identity. The writer urged authorities to circulate detailed descriptions of Burke's appearance and methods throughout the region in hopes of preventing future crimes. However, the passage of time and Burke's demonstrated ability to assume new identities made such efforts largely futile, and no further confirmed sightings were reported. The McAllister case became part of the grim folklore that accumulated around the California gold rush, a reminder that the promise of easy wealth had attracted not only honest fortune seekers, but predators who viewed the chaotic conditions as opportunities for crime. The story was occasionally retold in local newspapers and journals, usually as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting strangers in an environment where traditional social protections had broken down. However, the full details of the case were often sanitized or romanticized, with Hannah portrayed as an innocent victim rather than an active participant in the crimes that cost her father his life. In 1868, during renovations of the El Dorado County Courthouse, workers discovered a metal box hidden behind a false wall in the basement. The box contained documents and evidence related to several old cases, including additional material connected to the McAllister investigation. Among these documents was a detailed report, apparently prepared by Deputy Sheriff Crawford, but never filed with his official submissions, that provided a more complete and disturbing account of the crimes than had been made public at the time. Crawford's private report revealed that the investigation had uncovered evidence of premeditation that was far more extensive than had been previously known. The deputy had discovered that Burke had been conducting surveillance of the McAllister Ranch for weeks before his staged encounter with Hannah beside Weber Creek. Witnesses had reported seeing a man matching Burke's description watching the property from concealed positions in the surrounding hills, apparently studying the family's routines and security arrangements. More significantly, Crawford's investigation had revealed that Burke had been in contact with other criminals operating in the region, possibly as part of a larger network that shared information about potential targets and coordinated activities to avoid detection. Letters discovered during searches of mining camps had contained references to the McAllister family that suggested their wealth and isolation were well known among certain criminal elements, and that plans for targeting them had been discussed among multiple individuals. Perhaps most disturbing was Crawford's discovery that Hannah's participation in the crimes had been more extensive than had been initially understood. Evidence suggested that she had been actively gathering intelligence about her father's business activities and financial arrangements for weeks before his death. Passing this information to Burke and helping him plan the timing and execution of their attack. Her role had not been that of a manipulated victim, as many had assumed, but of an active conspirator who had been motivated by a combination of romantic obsession and genuine hatred for her father's control over her life. Crawford's report also contained a detailed analysis of the timeline of events leading up to Jeremiah's death, based on evidence that had been suppressed from the public accounts of the case. According to this reconstruction, the murder had been preceded by several days of careful preparation, during which Hannah had used her intimate knowledge of her father's habits to ensure that Burke would have unobserved access to him. The attack had taken place in the evening, when Jeremiah had been alone in his study reviewing accounts, and had been carried out with a fireplace tool that had later been cleaned and returned to its normal position, suggesting a cold-blooded calculation that contradicted any claim of spontaneous violence. The deputy's private notes also revealed that the search for the fugitives had been more extensive and successful than had been publicly acknowledged. Several confirmed sightings had been reported in the months following their disappearance, creating a trail that led south through the mining districts and eventually toward the Mexican border. However, political complications had prevented effective coordination between territorial authorities and Mexican officials, allowing Burke and possibly Hannah to escape beyond the reach of American law enforcement. Most significantly, Crawford's report contained evidence that Burke had not acted alone in planning and executing the McAllister crimes. References in seized correspondence suggested that he had been part of a larger criminal organization that specialized in targeting wealthy but isolated settlers throughout the American West. This organization appeared to have been sophisticated in its methods, with members assuming legitimate identities and establishing themselves in communities for extended periods before selecting and attacking their victims. The implications of Crawford's findings were disturbing, not only for what they revealed about the McAllister case specifically, but for what they suggested about the broader scope of organized criminal activity during the gold rush period. The deputy's investigation had identified several other suspicious disappearances and deaths that bore similarities to the McAllister case, suggesting that a pattern of predatory crime had been operating throughout the region for several years without being recognized by authorities, focused on more obvious forms of lawlessness such as claim jumping and road agency. Crawford's report concluded with the observation that the chaotic social conditions created by the gold rush had provided ideal cover for sophisticated criminals who possessed the intelligence and patience to exploit the trust and isolation that characterized many pioneer families. The deputy noted that traditional law enforcement methods were poorly suited to dealing with criminals who move frequently between jurisdictions and who possess the education and social skills necessary to blend seamlessly into respectable society. The discovery of Crawford's hidden report prompted a renewed investigation into the McAllister case, but by 1868, nearly 2 decades had passed since the original crimes, and most of the potential witnesses and sources of evidence had disappeared or died. The few attempts to follow up on the leads contained in the deputy's notes proved fruitless, and the case was once again filed away as an unsolved historical curiosity. However, the Crawford report had identified several other cases that appeared to be connected to the same criminal network that had included Owen Burke. Over the following months, investigators attempted to trace these connections, eventually identifying what appeared to be a systematic pattern of crimes targeting wealthy settlers throughout California, Oregon, and Nevada during the 1850s and 1860s. The scope and sophistication of this criminal enterprise suggested that it had been far more significant than any single case had indicated, and that dozens of families might have fallen victim to predators who had exploited the isolation and trust that characterized frontier society. The final documented reference to the McAllister case appeared in a scholarly article published in 1873 by Professor Marcus Whitfield of the University of California, who had undertaken a comprehensive study of criminal activity during the gold rush period. Whitfield's research had identified nearly 30 cases of missing or murdered settlers that appeared to share characteristics with the McAllister crimes, suggesting that the Burke organization or similar groups had been responsible for far more violence than had been previously recognized. Whitfield's most disturbing conclusion was that the true scope of these crimes would probably never be known, because many victims had been specifically selected for their isolation from family and community connections that might have prompted investigations into their disappearances. The professor estimated that hundreds of settlers might have been murdered by organized criminals during the gold rush period, with their deaths either going unnoticed or being attributed to the various other hazards that made frontier life dangerous. The article noted that the social disruption caused by the gold rush had created conditions that were ideal for predatory criminals, and that similar patterns of organized crime had probably characterized other periods of rapid westward expansion. Whitfield argued that the romanticized popular image of the American frontier had obscured the reality that lawlessness had often been more systematic and sophisticated than the random violence typically associated with frontier conditions. In his conclusion, Whitfield observed that cases like the McAllister murders demonstrated the vulnerability of isolated families to predators who possessed the intelligence and patience to exploit the trust that frontier conditions often made necessary for survival. The professor noted that Hannah McAllister's participation in her father's murder illustrated the way that criminals could exploit not only economic desperation, but emotional isolation to recruit accomplices from within their victims' own families. The scholarly attention given to the case by Whitfield and other researchers ensured that it would remain part of the historical record, but it also contributed to the gradual transformation of the story from a criminal investigation into an object of academic study. The human reality of the crimes gradually became obscured by analytical frameworks that emphasized social and economic factors, while minimizing the individual choices and moral failures that had made the violence possible. By the end of the 19th century, the McAllister case had become part of the larger mythology of the gold rush, a symbol of the moral corruption that wealth and isolation could produce in individuals who lacked the social constraints that normally governed human behavior. The story was retold in various forms, usually with details altered to emphasize whatever moral lesson the narrator wished to convey, until the actual facts of the case became difficult to distinguish from the folklore that had grown up around them. Today, the site of the McAllister Ranch has been absorbed into a modern residential development, with no marker or memorial indicating the location where Jeremiah McAllister died and was buried in 1850. The old county records containing the original investigation files were transferred to the California State Archives in 1923, where they remain available to researchers willing to navigate the bureaucratic obstacles that protect historical documents from casual examination. The case continues to attract occasional attention from historians and criminologists interested in patterns of violence during America's westward expansion. But the passage of time has made it impossible to resolve many of the questions that surrounded the original investigation. The fate of Owen Burke remains unknown, though some researchers believe he may have continued his criminal activities under various assumed identities until his death decades later. The exact location of Hannah McAllister's grave was never conclusively established, and the notebook discovered beside the Mokelumne River was lost during a courthouse fire in 1897. What remains is the documented evidence that a young woman, isolated by frontier conditions and corrupted by romantic obsession and financial desperation, participated willingly in the murder of her own father for the promise of wealth and freedom that ultimately brought her nothing but death in an unmarked grave beside a remote mountain stream. The case stands as a reminder that the forces that shaped the American West included not only the courage and determination typically celebrated in frontier mythology, but also the greed, violence, and moral corruption that flourished in an environment where traditional social constraints had broken down, and where the promise of easy wealth attracted both honest fortune seekers and those willing to take what they wanted through violence. The McAllister Ranch murders remain unsolved in their broader implications, a puzzle that illustrates how the pursuit of gold could transform ordinary people into participants in crimes that would have been unthinkable under more settled circumstances. The story serves as a dark counterpoint to the optimistic narratives that usually characterize accounts of westward expansion, demonstrating that the frontier experience could destroy families and corrupt individuals just as easily as it could provide opportunities for success and personal renewal. And perhaps most disturbing of all, the case suggests that similar crimes may have been far more common than historical records indicate, hidden by the very isolation and social disruption that made them possible in the first place. The voices of the victims have been silenced by time and violence, leaving only fragmentary evidence of tragedies that were repeated countless times across the American West during the tumultuous decades of the mid-19th century. In 1899, exactly 50 years after the original crimes, an unexpected development brought renewed attention to the McAllister case. When construction workers building a new railroad line through the Sierra Nevada foothills made a discovery that would provide the final piece to a puzzle that had haunted investigators for half a century. While excavating for a bridge foundation near the old mining town of Volcano, workers uncovered what appeared to be a carefully concealed cache buried approximately 8 feet below ground level in a location that would have been accessible but hidden during the gold rush period. The cache consisted of a waterproof metal container that held not only a substantial quantity of gold dust and coins, but also a collection of documents that provided unprecedented insight into the criminal organization that had included Owen Burke. Among these papers was what appeared to be Burke's personal journal, written in a cipher that took cryptographers several months to decode. When finally translated, the journal revealed details about the criminal network's operations that confirmed and expanded upon the worst suspicions that investigators had harbored for decades. According to Burke's journal entries, the organization had been far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The group had included at least 12 active members operating throughout California, Oregon, and Nevada, with additional associates in major cities who provided information about potential targets and assisted with the disposal of stolen goods. The organization had maintained safe houses and supply caches throughout the region, allowing members to move quickly and anonymously while avoiding detection by local law enforcement agencies that rarely coordinated their efforts across jurisdictional boundaries. Burke's journal described the McAllister operation as one of many similar crimes that the organization had committed during the 1850s, with victims selected according to specific criteria that included substantial assets, social isolation, and family dynamics that could be exploited to gain access and trust. The journal revealed that Hannah McAllister had not been Burke's first female accomplice. The organization had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and recruiting women who were dissatisfied with their circumstances and susceptible to romantic manipulation combined with promises of wealth and independence. Perhaps most disturbing was Burke's detailed account of Hannah's psychological transformation during the months leading up to her father's murder. According to the journal, Burke had recognized immediately that Hannah possessed both the intelligence and emotional vulnerability that could be exploited to turn her against her father. The process had involved weeks of careful manipulation, during which Burke had simultaneously cultivated Hannah's romantic feelings while systematically undermining her respect for her father's authority and her guilt about betraying family loyalty. Burke's journal entries described how he had gradually convinced Hannah that her father's control over her life constituted a form of imprisonment that justified extreme measures to escape. He had exploited Hannah's education and intelligence by framing their relationship in terms of romantic ideals borrowed from literature, presenting their planned crimes as noble rebellion against unjust authority rather than simple theft and murder. The journal revealed that Burke had been particularly skilled at identifying and exploiting the psychological pressures that frontier isolation placed on educated women who found themselves trapped in circumstances that offered little intellectual or emotional satisfaction. The journal also provided confirmation of what investigators had long suspected about the extent of planning that had preceded Jeremiah McAllister's murder. Burke had been gathering intelligence about the family for nearly 3 months before his staged encounter with Hannah beside Weber Creek, using a network of informants that included merchants, travelers, and even religious figures who had access to information about wealthy settlers throughout the region. The organization had maintained detailed records about potential targets, including maps of their properties, schedules of their activities, and assessments of their security arrangements and family relationships. According to Burke's account, the decision to target the McAllisters had been based not only on Jeremiah's known wealth, but on careful analysis of Hannah's psychological profile that suggested she could be successfully recruited as an accomplice. Burke had observed Hannah during several of her visits to nearby towns, noting her intelligence, her apparent dissatisfaction with rural isolation, and what he characterized as her father's domineering treatment of her. The journal revealed that the organization had developed sophisticated techniques for psychological assessment that allowed them to identify individuals who might be vulnerable to recruitment under appropriate circumstances. Burke's journal entries describing the actual murder were clinical in their detachment, revealing a level of premeditation and cold-blooded calculation that was even more disturbing than investigators had imagined. According to his account, Hannah had administered a sleeping draught to her father's evening coffee, ensuring that he would be unconscious when Burke entered the house through a window that Hannah had left unlocked. The blow that killed Jeremiah had been delivered while he was helpless, making the crime not a crime of passion, but a calculated execution carried out with Hannah's active assistance. The journal revealed that Hannah's emotional state during and after the murder had been more complex than Burke had anticipated. While she had participated willingly in the planning and execution of the crime, the reality of her father's death had produced a psychological crisis that Burke characterized as both genuine grief and terror at what she had done. Burke noted that Hannah's emotional instability had become a significant problem during their flight from the ranch, as she had alternated between periods of manic excitement about their future together and episodes of profound guilt and depression about her betrayal of family loyalty. More significantly for understanding Hannah's ultimate fate, Burke's journal revealed that her psychological deterioration had convinced him that she represented an unacceptable security risk to the organization's continued operations. The journal entries from their months as fugitives described Burke's growing conviction that Hannah's guilt and instability would eventually lead her to confess their crimes to authorities, potentially exposing not only Burke himself, but the entire criminal network that had made their escape possible. The journal made clear that Hannah's murder had not been the result of a romantic quarrel, as some investigators had speculated, but a calculated decision to eliminate a liability that threatened the organization's security. Burke's account of Hannah's death was brief but definitive, confirming that he had killed her beside the Mokelumne River in May of 1850 and had attempted to conceal her body in a way that would prevent identification if it were discovered. The journal revealed that Hannah had suspected Burke's intentions and had attempted to flee during their final camp, but her unfamiliarity with wilderness survival had made escape impossible. Burke noted with characteristic detachment that Hannah's final words had been an expression of regret, not for her father's murder, but for her trust in Burke's promises of love and partnership. The discovery of Burke's journal also provided crucial information about the organization's subsequent activities and ultimate dissolution. According to the entries, the success of the McAllister operation had been offset by increased law enforcement attention that had made similar crimes more difficult to execute without detection. Several members of the organization had been arrested or killed during the 1850s, and the group had gradually fragmented as surviving members either retired from criminal activity or relocated to other regions where opportunities might be more favorable. Burke's own fate, according to the journal's final entries, had involved a gradual transition from organized crime to more conventional criminal activities, such as gambling and confidence schemes that required less violence but offered smaller profits. The journal's last dated entry, from 1857, described Burke's arrival in Portland, Oregon, where he planned to establish a new identity and possibly legitimate business interests using the substantial wealth he had accumulated during his years with the criminal organization. The discovery of Burke's cache and journal prompted a final investigation into the McAllister case, led by retired detective Samuel Morrison, who had maintained an interest in the case throughout his career. Morrison's investigation, conducted during the early 1900s, attempted to trace Burke's activities after 1857 and determine whether he had indeed succeeded in establishing a legitimate life or had continued his criminal career under a different identity. Morrison's research eventually led him to Portland City records that documented the arrival and subsequent business activities of a man named Patrick O'Brien, whose physical description and documented background were consistent with Owen Burke assuming a new identity. According to these records, O'Brien had established a successful import business during the 1860s and had become a respected member of Portland's Irish immigrant community before his death in 1874. The record suggested that Burke had indeed succeeded in escaping the consequences of his crimes and had lived out his life in comfort and respectability, his true identity unknown to those around him. However, Morrison's investigation also uncovered evidence that cast doubt on the completeness of Burke's transformation from criminal to respectable businessman. Several suspicious deaths and disappearances in Portland during the 1860s bore similarities to the crimes that had characterized Burke's earlier career, suggesting that he might have continued his predatory activities even while maintaining the appearance of legitimate success. Morrison concluded that Burke had probably never completely abandoned his criminal methods, but had simply become more selective and cautious in choosing victims who were unlikely to be missed or whose deaths could be easily attributed to natural causes or accidents. The final chapter in the McAllister case came in 1923, when the California State Archives undertook a comprehensive review of historical criminal cases as part of a larger project to preserve and catalog important legal documents. During this review, researchers discovered that several other unsolved cases from the Gold Rush period showed striking similarities to the McAllister murders, suggesting that the Burke organization or similar groups had been responsible for far more violence than had been previously documented. The archival research revealed a pattern of missing persons cases and suspicious deaths that stretched across the entire American West during the middle decades of the 19th century, with common elements that included wealthy but isolated victims, evidence of inside knowledge about their assets and security arrangements, and the systematic elimination of witnesses or accomplices who might pose security risks to the perpetrators. The researchers estimated that organized criminal groups might have been responsible for hundreds of deaths during this period, with the true scope of their activities concealed by the social chaos and limited law enforcement capabilities that characterized frontier conditions. The archival study also revealed that the McAllister case had influenced law enforcement practices throughout the region, leading to improved coordination between jurisdictions and the development of more sophisticated investigative techniques designed to detect and track criminals who operated across wide geographic areas. The case had demonstrated the vulnerability of isolated settlers to predatory crime and had contributed to the establishment of territorial and later state police agencies that possessed broader authority and better resources than local law enforcement had provided. Perhaps most significantly, the McAllister case had helped establish legal precedents regarding the prosecution of women who participated in violent crimes, particularly in cases where romantic manipulation or emotional coercion might have influenced their decisions. Hannah's willing participation in her father's murder had challenged contemporary assumptions about women's moral nature and criminal capacity, forcing legal authorities to develop more nuanced approaches to cases involving female defendants who could not simply be dismissed as innocent victims of male manipulation. The case also contributed to evolving understanding of psychological factors in criminal behavior, particularly regarding the ways that social isolation and emotional manipulation could corrupt individuals who might otherwise have remained law-abiding citizens. Hannah's transformation from dutiful daughter to active participant in murder demonstrated that criminal behavior could emerge from circumstances rather than inherent moral deficiency, a recognition that would eventually influence both legal practice and social policy regarding crime prevention and rehabilitation. In the final analysis, the McAllister Ranch murders represent more than simply another chapter in the violent history of the American frontier. The case provides insight into the complex interaction between individual psychology and social circumstances that could transform ordinary people into participants in extraordinary crimes. Hannah McAllister's choice to participate in her father's murder cannot be explained solely by romantic manipulation or financial desperation, but must be understood as the result of multiple factors, including social isolation, limited opportunities for independence, and the breakdown of traditional moral constraints that frontier conditions often produced. The case also illustrates the sophistication and scope of organized criminal activity during a period that is often characterized as dominated by random or opportunistic violence. Burke and his associates represented a type of criminal that challenged contemporary understanding of frontier lawlessness, demonstrating that the American West had attracted not only honest fortune seekers and random desperados, but sophisticated predators who possessed the intelligence and organization necessary to exploit the vulnerabilities that rapid social change had created. Today, more than 170 years after Jeremiah McAllister's death, the site of his ranch bears no trace of the violence that occurred there or the family tragedy that it represented. The modern subdivision that occupies the property houses families who are unaware of the dark history beneath their manicured lawns and suburban streets. The gold that drew so many thousands of people to California during the 1840s and 1850s has long since been exhausted, and the social conditions that made crimes like the McAllister murders possible have been transformed by the very success of the westward expansion that initially created such chaos and opportunity. Yet the fundamental human motivations that drove Hannah McAllister to participate in her father's murder remain unchanged by the passage of time or the transformation of social circumstances. The desire for independence and prosperity, the vulnerability to romantic manipulation, and the capacity for moral corruption under extreme circumstances continue to influence human behavior in ways that make the McAllister case relevant to understanding contemporary crime and social dysfunction. The voices of Jeremiah, Hannah, and Owen Burke have been silenced by death and time, leaving only fragmentary evidence of choices made and consequences suffered in a remote mountain valley during one of the most chaotic periods in American history. Their story serves as a reminder that the pursuit of wealth and freedom can corrupt as easily as it can redeem, and that the American dream of prosperity and independence has always carried within it the seeds of violence and tragedy for those who lack the moral strength to pursue legitimate means, or who find themselves trapped in circumstances that make such pursuit seem impossible. The McAllister Ranch murders remain ultimately a mystery not of facts, but of human nature. A puzzle about the capacity for ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil when circumstances align in particular ways. The case provides no easy answers about criminal motivation or moral responsibility, but it offers evidence about the complex interaction between individual choice and social circumstance that continues to shape human behavior in ways that are both predictable and terrifyingly unpredictable. And perhaps that is the most disturbing lesson of all, that under the right circumstances, Any of us might be capable of choices that we would have considered unthinkable under more favorable conditions, and that the boundary between civilization and barbarism remains as fragile today as it was during the gold rush era, when Hannah McAllister chose love and gold over family loyalty, and paid for that choice with her life in an unmarked grave beside a mountain stream that continues to flow, indifferent to human suffering. Through the California wilderness, where so many dreams ended in tragedy during America's relentless march toward the Pacific Ocean.